Hi everyone, I'm Mary Mancusi, author of the book The Camelot Code, and I'm here for another edition of the Once and Future Writers Club.
Oh, the habits of my heart, I can't say no. It's ripping.
Okay, if you guys have been watching all the videos, you might notice the background here looks a little bit different. I actually got a laptop that I'm using instead of a desktop, so I decided to take it on the road. Okay, it's about 3 feet from where I was at my desk, but why not mix it up a little? And the best part is I actually cleaned my office this weekend. I know, it's crazy. And so everything is in order. I got some new bookcases, so you can see I was able to put all my books in the bookcase. I have so many books, it's ridiculous. And actually categorize them, so like paranormal and contemporary or adult or middle grade or young adult. And they're all kind of neatly ordered. Now, how long that will last? Who's to say? You can even see over here I have some of my books. Authors get a lot of author copies. That's something you might not know. And so I have a lot of copies of my own books, which I use for giveaways, or if I go to events, I might have a booth where I sell and sign my books. So yeah, I have to store all of those when I'm not somewhere. And so new bookcases mean a new chance to take those out of boxes and put them on display. Today we're going to talk about plotting, and it's going to be part one of a 3-part series because I feel like plotting is so important and something that it really requires a lot of study. And I don't want to rush through beginning, middle, and end and have your head spinning and not be able to know what you're doing still when you're done with the videos. So today we're going to talk about beginnings. And beginnings are really important because it's your first chance to bring the reader in. If you bore the reader, if you annoy the reader, they're not going to read to your beautiful middle or end. So it's very important you get that beginning right. And a lot of new writers have a hard time with that. They don't know exactly where their story is supposed to start. So we're going to talk about a few ways to tell that and figure out where your story is supposed to start and how you hook the reader from the very first page. Okay, so but first, we must do our geek thing of the day. All right, my geek thing of the day is actually what I'm wearing. I can't remember if I wore this in another video, so I'm sorry if you've already seen it, but I love this shirt so much. It says, "I'd rather be a book dragon than a book worm." Someone actually also gave me a coffee mug that says the same thing. I love that saying. I totally would rather be a book dragon than a bookworm. And so all of you are today honorary book dragons, okay? Because way better than bookworms. Okay, as I said before, we're going to start talking about plotting, specifically beginnings. And there's a lot of different ways you can begin your book, but I think there are certain elements that really need to be included somehow in the beginning of your story to really bring the reader into the story and set their expectations, help them figure out what this story is about, what they should expect for the rest of the story or book, and get them on the train so they're going on this journey with you. And the first thing I think is that it's important to introduce is your characters, your main characters. Who is starring in this story? They should be introduced probably in the very first page. There's nothing more disappointing than a book that has a prologue about this really exciting adventure and this crazy character, and then at the end they either die or they're just a dream or something, and then the main character is introduced secondary, and you're like, wait, but what about that other guy? Readers will always imprint and get excited about the first character they meet. So don't disappoint them and bring in the actual person they're supposed to care about later, because it will be very confusing for them. That said, if you have like 10 major characters, which I don't recommend anyway, I would bring them in a little more gradually. Introduce us to the important ones first, and then maybe bring the other ones in as you go, because it can be very confusing if you open a book and there's suddenly 10 different characters with different names and different descriptions, and you're not sure who is who, to try to keep track of that and follow the story. And when a reader is confused, they're going to put down the book. So we definitely don't want that. Okay, so once you introduce your characters, and you don't have to go into too much description at first, try to weave the details into the story. One of the worst ways that new writers will start a book is to have the character wake up which is cliche anyway, probably from a dream, and go to the mirror and look in the mirror and think about what they look like. Now, how many times do you wake up and look in the mirror and be like, oh, my wavy blonde hair is cascading down my shoulders, my brown eyes are deep pools of chocolate, or whatever. You don't think that. That's very unnatural and very awkward. So while you can introduce your character physically in the first chapter, and you should, let's give them some kind of description, weave it into the story, make it more organic. For example, work it into the action of the story. If she's running from a bad guy, maybe she can toss her brown hair over her shoulder as she runs, or her brown eyes locked onto the hidden diary. I have really bad examples here, but you know what I mean. You want to bring it into the story, just kind of slide it in so the reader barely notices, instead of focusing like on every single thing about that person right from the go, looking into the mirror. And in addition to finding out what the character looks like, we should also get a kind of peek into their personality. So try to put them in a situation where they have to interact with a thing or a person or something that gives you a little clue as to who they are. Maybe they kick a puppy, and then you know that they're probably not a good guy. Or they help someone across the street. These are terrible examples, but you see what I mean. By doing something, that's showing versus telling. You probably hear that a lot in writing, show versus tell. So you could say, here's Mary, and she is such a good girl, and she's very kind to everyone she meets. And that's kind of a boring way to introduce Mary. But if you say instead, like, Mary walked out her door and she saw an old widow trying to cross the street, and she ran over and helped her across the street, that shows something about her character without you having to just beat the reader over the head and tell them what the character is like. So try to weave in descriptions about who your characters are and what kind of people they are right in the very beginning, so the reader can understand who the story is about. After that, you also need to have a setting. A story cannot exist in a vacuum. And we did 2 world building videos beforehand, so you can go back and watch those if you need some thoughts about, creating a world or a setting. And that world or setting should be introduced right at the beginning of your story. The reader needs to know the rules of the world. They need to know if this is a world that has magic, if this is a world that's realistic, if this is a world that is very much like our present day, or that was set a long time ago, or set in the future. Are we on planet Earth? Are we on another planet? Are we on a fantasy world that doesn't exist? You need to communicate that in the very first chapter, and we need to have some details of the world woven in. Again, you don't have to start your story with a big paragraph of like, the planet Oasis has been around for 5 billion years and its inhabitants are humanoid reptile hybrids. That's boring. That's just dumping info on the reader, and the reader's going to be like, let's get to the action. Let's get to the story. So all those things you can know in the back of your mind, and you can kind of give the reader a little bit as you go. But you do need to give them something. If they're just running around in a vacuum of a world with no details and no rules or concrete examples, the reader is going to get lost and they're not going to be engaged to the story. So the other thing that's extremely important to have in your beginning is something to happen. There are too many stories where the first chapter is only the introduction, only the characters, only the world building. It's like, here's everything that you need to know about this world, but absolutely nothing happens the whole first chapter. The reader will not put up with that. You need to get to the action. So you can introduce this ordinary world, this, status quo, this how everything is beforehand, but you better quickly get to whatever it is that's going to change that status quo, that's going to rock this character's world, and that's going to be the main conflict of the story. Something has to happen, or the reader will not be engaged. So I know that's a lot, and your head's probably spinning, and you're like, how can I take all these elements and cram them into a story? And you know what? It is hard. No one's saying this is an easy thing, but it is an important thing to master. People do not respect how difficult the beginning of a story is, and that is where a lot of writers fall short. when they start sending their work out to agents and editors for publication. Because if you don't grab the editor from like the very first 3 pages, they won't read anything else. So you might have the best middle or the best ending known to mankind, but they'll never get there if you can't master that beginning. So take your time, really think about your story before you start writing it, and figure out what you want your reader to know about your story from the very first page. Who your main characters are, what they are like. What kind of story is this? Is it a mystery? Is it an action adventure? Is it a fantasy epic? And where is it set? What is this world like that you are introducing the characters, that the reader is stepping into? And what is going on? What's the conflict? What's happening in the world to make this an exciting story? To make this the kind of story that readers are going to want to turn the page and keep reading and find out what happens next. So like anything else, all my other videos, I'm going to put a worksheet down below that you can work on to try to start thinking about your beginning. And I really urge you to pre-write in this case and come up with a great scene that you're going to start your story with that incorporates all these elements, and then start writing and have fun with it. And when you're ready, next video, we're going to talk about middles. And I think the middle is even harder than the beginning. There's nothing easy about writing. I'm sorry. You know, that's a spoiler. Writing is hard. But I think the middle is something that trips a lot of people up because they start losing interest. It starts feeling like work. It's not shiny and new anymore. So we're going to talk about how to motivate to push through the middle, what needs to happen in the middle so the reader doesn't get bored. As bored as the writer who's writing it. And getting all the way to the 3rd video in this series, which is going to be endings. Cool, exciting, satisfying endings. So thank you again for watching this. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next week for another episode of the Once and Future Writers Club.
Oh, the habits of my heart.